Today we're going to look at the numbers and crush many of the myths of the fighting on the Eastern Front of World War II. As stated in the last video, the German army has a reputation of being vastly superior tactically and operationally to the Red Army on the Eastern Front of World War II. The story goes like this: despite having inferior numbers, a lack of tanks and equipment, and a lack of replacements, the German Heer killed many more times the number of Red Army soldiers and tanks. The German generals, the ones saying how superior they were, said their divisions were like rocks drowning in a sea of Soviet rifles and tanks. But is this actually the case? With the opening of new archival material, a different story is beginning to emerge. One that says the German Heer wasn't superior to the Red Army. And the statistics give weight to that argument. Let's tell the story. Here we have a table from the book The Price of Victory, the Red Army's Casualties in the Great Patriotic War. Now these statistics are some of the latest to emerge and also might be a little bit conservative, and we'll compare these to others later. On the left we have the year and the type of casualties sustained. We have the USSR and her allies, Germany and her allies on the far right, and in the middle we have the ratio of losses between the two sides. At the bottom you'll see the totals for the whole war, so let's dive in. 1941, massive Soviet losses sustained. 1,313,100 dead or missing, 3,478,200 captured, a grand total of 4.7 million casualties in 1941. Compare this to the staggeringly small number of German and Axis allied losses sustained that year, and the ratio favours the Germans 12.2 to 1. The ratio of captured soldiers is an incredible 325.1 to 1, and it's massive numbers of Soviet men and material captured. If the war had ended in 1941, this probably would have been the most successful war of all time. However, it didn't end in 1941. The Soviets continued to fight. 1942, the Soviets lose more men killed than they did in 1941. And the ratio favours the Germans again at 3.5 to 1. That's actually a better ratio than in 1941, but here's where things differ. 1942, the captured ratio goes down to just 12 to 1 from the 325 to 1 it was before. A grand total of 5 to 1 in losses, still favouring the Germans. And it's still impressive numbers, but hold on a second, why wasn't the German army able to repeat the successes of the previous year? They actually killed more Soviets than they did the year before, so it's not like they weren't capable of fighting. They were actually fighting harder in 1942. We must also bear in mind here that the Germans only lost 312,000 men in 1941. Not terrible losses compared to what the Soviets suffered, and this isn't including replacements, which we'll get to later. So why then aren't the Germans able to capture as many Soviets as they did the year before, when they killed more this year? And it doesn't stop in 1942. 1943, more Red Army soldiers die than ever before, 2.3 million. Germany's losses are also higher so far, 700,700, with another 49,000 Axis allied losses. Yet the ratio still favours them by 3.1 to 1. Captured is 4.1 to 1, but just look at the numbers, just 600,000 captured Soviets. This is pocket money compared to the ratio achieved in 1941 or even 1942. So what's going on? Why are more people dead but less people are captured? Despite a ratio of 3.3 to 1, the Germans are beginning to lose, which is a bit strange. 1944, Red Army losses come down to just 1.9 million, captured 130,000 for a grand total of 2,068,700. Compare this to the Axis though, 1,200,000 Germans killed or missing, 523,000 captured, a total of 1,756,800. This out of 2,094,000 total Axis losses sustained in 1941. The ratio is actually 1 to 1 at this point, and the Axis lose more men than the Soviets do in 1944. The ratio of captured soldiers goes into the Soviet favour at 1 to 5.8, and the Germans are on the defensive here. Now, I've heard a lot about how great the Germans were on defence. So why, the narrative says that, so why isn't the numbers reflecting that? Surely, if the Germans were so good at defence, the numbers would reflect that. But yet they're not. Why aren't they inflicting many more times the number of casualties, like the narrative says they should be? And the traditional narrative says they do, so what's going on? They're not even inflicting twice as many losses now. 1945, a total of 924,000 Soviet losses. The Germans themselves lose 1,463,800. More than the Soviets. Total Axis losses are 1,800,000, a ratio of 1 to 2. Again, the Germans are on the defensive, and an army on the defensive has advantages over attackers. So why then aren't they inflicting many more times the number of losses? Total losses for the whole of the war. Soviets 8.7 million dead, 5.8 million captured, a total of 14,654,000. German losses 3.5 million dead, 1.4 million captured, and a total of 4,941,600. However, total Axis Allied numbers, 3 million dead, 2 million captured, a total of 5,980,000. Overall ratio 2.5 to 1. Now the author does admit that due to discrepancies in the archival material that the ratio may be at worst slightly higher at 3 to 1. So a ratio of 2.5 or maybe 3 to 1 is the overall ratio. That's not bad. Considering the ratio in 1941, 3 to 1 isn't bad. Considering the Red Army had to retake all the ground lost and then fight their way into Central Europe, that ratio is not that bad. And just to point out, overall Soviet losses were around 30 million, but that's including civilians. This is the number of military deaths. But in case you think these numbers are wrong somehow, let's look at the statistics from a different source. This time I'm going to look at Glantz, who's relying on Khrushchev, whose numbers are disputed, but we'll get into them anyway, just in case. Here, we're assuming that the casualties are double for the Soviets and 2 million more for the Germans. The ratio is at most 4.27 to 1. So we have a casualty ratio of anywhere between 2.5 to 1 and 4.27 to 1, depending on how you count the numbers. The true figure is probably somewhere in between, but again, even at 4.27 to 1, this is not that bad of a ratio. The Soviets lose, at the absolute most, 4 men to every Axis man that they kill. So, myth number 1, the Germans killed or captured many more times the number of Soviets. No, it's 2.5 or maybe 3 to 1, or at the very most 4.27 to 1. That's not the 10 to 1 as some people keep spouting. And as mentioned, the Red Army had to fight their way into Central Europe as well as retake all the ground that they'd lost. The price of victory, yes, it was high, but realistically, it's not that high. Yes, the Germans did inflict a lot of losses in 1941, and that is where this myth of German superiority arises. Myth number 2, the Wehrmacht didn't have the manpower to sustain its losses and slowly decreased in size as the war went on. Incorrect. Between the 22nd of June 1941 and the 30th of June 1942, the Wehrmacht in the east increased its size by 110,000 men. Between the 1st of July 1942 and the 30th of June 1943, the Wehrmacht in the east increased its size by 365,000 men. The total number of losses sustained between the 22nd of June 1941 and the 30th of June 1943 for the Wehrmacht was 3,965,000. Total number of replacements 4,440,000 for an increase in the number of men by 475,000. Now some of you may be sitting there scratching your heads going, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. One, the narrative says something different. In the narrative, individual divisions were suffering from manpower crises. So this doesn't make sense. And yet the numbers show that the Germans were replacing their losses. So what's going on there? And two, these losses don't match the numbers on the previous table. In fact, they're higher. According to the price of victory, the total number of German losses was 1,721,000 by the end of 1943. Yet enduring the whirlwind, which is getting its information from Müller-Hillebrand's Das Heer 1933-45, published in the 50s or 60s, the total losses up to the 30th of June 1943 is 3,965,000. So, what's going on here? Well, interestingly, it seems that the price of victory was giving conservative estimates of German losses in the original table. To quote another author, Glantz, by 31st of January 1941, the German army in the east has suffered 917,000 casualties in addition to 18,000 Luftwaffe casualties and significant losses among the armies of Germany's allies in Finland, Romania and Hungary. Looking at enduring the whirlwind, overall German losses in the east by the end of November, including sick transported back to Germany for treatment, amounted to 926,000 men. During the same period, 410,000 replacements had arrived to join the 90,000 already present within divisional replacement battalions, meaning that the oust here would have been short 426,000 men by December. Total German army casualties in the east amount to 1,094,000 men by 31st of December 1941, including 167,000 killed, 600,000 wounded, 34,000 missing, and at least 291,000 sick, who had to be repatriated to Germany. In addition, an estimated 2,735 tanks and 104 assault guns have been listed as totally knocked out by this point, with a further 415 being permanently lost in January. These numbers probably include men who would later return to the ranks, which is why they're higher. If they're not, then the ratio of losses in 1941 drops further than the 12.2 to 1 originally stated. Some of you may think that the Soviet losses were higher, and we'll get to that shortly, but for now let's just take in the fact that the ratio isn't that bad. 2 or 3 to 1, maybe 4 to 1, doesn't sound like the Germans were drowning under Soviet hordes. Myth number 3, the Soviets had vastly more men in the field at any one moment in time. Incorrect. The idea that the Soviets outnumbered the Germans in the field 10 to 1, as some people think that they do, is completely false. This table, taken from Glantz's When Titans Clashed, shows the comparative strengths of the combat forces of the Soviet-German front between 1941 and 1945. The dates are on the left, the Soviets in the centre left, and the Germans on the right, and the ratio in the middle. Eagle-eyed viewers may be typing away now, saying that the ratio doesn't add up. Please bear in mind that the ratio is not taking into account the Axis or Soviet allies, and is just focusing on the Soviet losses versus German losses, which is the main point. Let's start at the beginning. 22nd of June 1941, Germany outnumbers the Red Army at the front, 2,700,000 Soviets versus 1,100,000 Germans. With Axis allies, the total Axis forces in the Eastern Front is 3,957,910. A ratio of 1 to 1.14. With Axis allies included, the ratio is actually more like 1 to 1.44. Now the Soviets do have a lot of mobilization potential, 12 million men. However, you can't just suddenly spring 12 million men and women into action. They don't have enough equipment at hand to even do that, especially since they're busy packing up their industry brick by brick and then shipping it to the Urals. It takes time to mobilize these men, and meanwhile Germany is busy devouring 4.8 million Soviet soldiers at the front, as shown in the first table. On the 11th of September 1941, the Soviets had 3.4 million men at the front, Axis total 4.2 million, with 3.3 million of them German. Notice how the German army has increased in size. The ratio is more or less 1 to 1, with Axis allies increasing that further in favour of the Axis. 1st of November 1941, just 2.2 million Soviets versus 2.8 million Germans, a ratio of 1 to 1.3 in favour of the Germans. Total Axis troops 3.5 million. Again, Germans and Axis outnumber the Soviets. 1st of December 1941, finally for the first real time in the war, the Soviets outnumbered the Germans. 4.1 million Soviets versus 3.3 million Axis, 2.76 million of them German. A ratio of 1.52 to 1 in favour of the Soviets, and this is when the Soviets start fighting back properly. This is Moscow 1941. The German army is defeated outside the city. As we saw before, losses by the end of the year for the Germans were 312,000 men, total Axis 384,000. Soviet losses by this point are 4,791,000. Doesn't it seem strange though that the Germans lose the ability to advance and defeat their enemy when they no longer outnumber the Soviets? Very, very strange. Even if they are outnumbered now, 1.52 to 1, surely the superior German army can take on that many Soviets at once. That's not even 2 to 1. They're outnumbered by maybe 700,000. The Soviet horde is not really a horde at this point, yet the Germans cannot advance. Very, very strange. Notice that the Germans lose men by March of 1942 down to 2,580,000. Soviets gain men to 4,663,000, now outnumbering the Germans 1.8 to 1. However, by the time we get to the 5th of May 1942, the Germans and Axis as a whole are beginning to recover their losses. They now have 3.4 million men in the east compared to the Soviet 5.4 million. In 1 month, now to June of 1942, the Soviets have lost men and Germany and her allies have gained men. 5.3 million Soviets versus 3.5 million Axis, a ratio of 1.98 to 1. With this ratio, the Germans speed off towards the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Hundreds of miles taken in a matter of weeks. 5th of July, ratio is at 2.1 to 1 and Blau is still underway. 6th of August 1942, losses occurred on the German side, decreasing the number of men that they actually have. The Soviets are beginning to fight back, but the Battle of Stalingrad hasn't even begun yet. There are some historians out there who will say that the Battle of Stalingrad was lost before the Germans even set foot in the city. These numbers seem to support that conclusion. 7th of October 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad is at full swing. The German blitzkrieg is stopped in its tracks. Look at the ratio, still only 2.28 to 1 at this point. Where are the Red Army hordes? I'm not seeing them. Surely the superior German Schutzen can take on 2.28 Soviet riflemen. Again, the numbers say they can't. 1st of November, just prior to Operation Uranus, German numbers in the east are declining. This is before Operation Uranus. After Operation Uranus and after the surrender of the 6th Army on the 2nd of February 1942, German forces down to just 2.2 million. 6.1 million Soviets, so therefore a ratio of 2.77 to 1. According to the first table we saw, Soviet losses in 1942 were 3,900,000 and the Germans only 594,000, although that's not including the 6th Army, who haven't quite surrendered yet. Yet the Germans have fled the Caucasus. Surely, at this point, they're defeated? No. 3rd of April 1943, the Germans have 2.8 million men. Their best general, Manstein, has just crushed the Soviets at the Third Battle of Kharkov against forces outnumbering him, to quote him, many times their superior in numbers. Manstein says of the winter campaign, the German fighting troops, convinced of their superiority as soldiers, stood their ground in the most desperate situations, and their courage and self-sacrifice did much to compensate for the enemy's numerical preponderance. At worst, the Soviets outnumber the Germans 2.77 to 1 at this time on the strategic scale. Again, doesn't sound like the German generals are making good their tactical or operational superiority. I mean, Manstein is, But he's the best that they've got. What about the rest? Are they doing anything about this? The question now was how the German side should continue to struggle the following summer, 1943. Obviously, after so many major formations had been lost, there would no longer be the forces available to mount another crucial offensive on the scale of 1941 and 1942. By the 9th of July 1943, the Germans alone have 3,483,000 men. That's 100,000 more men than they had at the beginning of the war in 1941, when they took out 4,700,000 Soviets. A ratio of 12 to 1 in their own losses. Now, suddenly, they couldn't fight an enemy that outnumbered them 1.93 to 1. And that's not including Axis allies. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. Now they can't even break through to the enemy's operational depths at Kursk. They could do that just months before when they had 1 million fewer men. So what's happened here? And these numbers may be too low. According to Enduring the Whirlwind, again using Müller-Hilleband's Das Heer, the Germans had 475,000 more men on the 30th of June 1943 than they did compared to the beginning of the war. The German army is at its peak in July of 1943, yet it cannot break through to the operational depths now. Why? Because the German army is no longer fighting an enemy that's unprepared for war. 1941, it breaks through to the operational depths against an enemy that's numerically inferior and not prepared for war, and then runs rings around it until that enemy finally regains its footing. 1942, again, it breaks through to the operational depths of an enemy that outnumbers it barely 2 to 1, although not in the area it breaks through at. 1943, somehow now cannot break through an enemy that outnumbers it barely 2 to 1 again, when it has more men than it's ever had before. It's because that enemy is no longer unprepared for war. The Soviets and Germans at this stage are equal in strength, but the Soviets have double the men. And while they had double the men the year before, the Soviets have finally recovered. They have the equipment that they didn't have before. They have the organisation they didn't have before. They have the air force they didn't have before. They have the means to fight back. And so they do. 27th of July 1943, German losses are mounting, having suffered at Kursk. 14th of October 1943, German losses increasing again, with 800,000 men lost in the east in 1943. They've also lost the initiative. They're also now fighting a two-front war, and they're fighting enemies that are equipped to deal with them. Still, they have as many men in the east as they did in March of 1942, but this time they're outnumbered 2.57 to 1. By March of 1944, the Germans are outnumbered 2.66 to 1, and similar numbers by May 1944. But note, the ratio is actually better than it was in February of 1943, when Manstein is about to fight the Third Battle of Kharkov, and there's more German troops in the field than there were back then. So could the Germans pull it back? No. 1st of July 1944, a fifth of all German troops in the east are suddenly gone. Staggering losses. Why? Operation Bagration is in full swing, the destruction of Army Group Centre. By September 1944, the Germans are definitely on the retreat with a ratio of 3.15 to 1. But wait, the Germans are on the defensive at this point, and the Germans are great on the defensive, right? Surely they could inflict staggering losses on the Soviets. No, the Soviets take fewer casualties in 1944 than the Axis allies, and by October, German soldiers in the east reach their lowest point yet, 1.7 million. Now they're outnumbered 3.69 to 1. This is in fact the highest ratio in favour of the Soviets for the whole war, up until the very end, and it's not even 4 to 1. Again, not even 4 to 1. Doesn't sound like hordes to me, and no, it's not. It's not. November of 1944, the ratio gets slightly better for the Germans at 3.6 to 1. New Year's Day 1945, and the ratio is 3.3 to 1. The Germans are somehow recovering their losses despite being at the bottom of their manpower barrel. 1st of March 1945, the ratio is 3.17 to 1, although both the Soviets now and the Germans are reducing the numbers at this point. 1st of April 1945, 3.5 to 1, with the Germans at 1,960,000 men, which was higher than in October of 1944. 8th of May 1945, the war's end, a ratio of 3.77 to 1. This was the worst ratio of the war, and it occurred right at the end. Again, at no point did the Soviets outnumber the Germans in the field by 4 to 1. 3.77 at the most, and that was about the very end. Most of the time it was 2 to 1, and in 1941 it was definitely a lot less than that. And in the words of the German generals, the Wehrmacht was decreasing in number as the war went on. As shown, up until 1943, this is incorrect. They actually peaked in number just before Kursk in 1943. Myth number 5. Some of you will say, well, the Germans lost because the German army was fighting a two-front war. They couldn't deploy all their men in the east. Incorrect. Assuming that the last table wasn't good enough for you, let's look at the numbers again. At the beginning of the war, on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht has 7 million men in total, with just under 4 million in the east. The Soviets have 5.3 million men at this time, 2.7 million on the Eastern Front. At this time, Germany is fighting in North Africa with 2 divisions. It's not fighting a two-front war. Yes, it has to protect its other borders, but so do the Soviets. Stalin is really worried about Japan and keeps a sizable portion of the Red Army in the Far East. According to Enduring the Whirlwind, even on the 1st of May 1942, the Soviets have 5 million men in the Far East, or internally, and 5.6 million at the front. So, there's a slight variation in the statistics here, but again, almost half of the Soviet army is not actually at the front. By the 1st of November 1942, this number decreases to 3.8 million elsewhere and 6.6 million at the front, probably for Operation Uranus and Mars, but again, sizable numbers still elsewhere. And again, the argument about Germany fighting a two-front war doesn't add up, as the Western Allies don't really become a factor until 1943 or even mid-1944, while Operation Bag Ration is tearing through Army Group Center and the Soviets have already won the war. The Germans lose the war in the East before the two-front war even becomes a thing. Myth number 6. The German army couldn't keep up production in tanks or equipment. Incorrect. Up to the 31st of December 1941, the Germans produced half as many rifles as the Soviets. Considering they only took 312,000 casualties, or maybe a million if you follow Glantz, that's enough to replenish what they lost, especially if you consider they actually had more in reserve stock prior to the war. The Germans produced more machine guns and pistols in 1941, and more tanks than the Soviets. Yes, in the first year of the war, the Soviets produced less tanks than the Germans. Now, by 1942, as you can see, the Soviets do start producing a lot more rifles, guns, and tanks. We'll get into the tank production in a second, but myth number 7, the Soviets charged into battle without rifles. Incorrect. They were producing enough even by the time of Stalingrad. There is one reference in Glantz's Stalingrad Trilogy where the Soviets didn't have enough rifles to fully equip their men. On the 21st to 22nd of September 1942, Batiuk cannot find enough rifles to equip the whole of his 284th Rifle Division, and so he only sends one regiment across the Volga. 1043rd Regiment has enough rifles, although not enough of its other equipment, and so goes into the 62nd Army's reserve, while the rest of the division and the rest of the equipment arrives. That is it. No reference that I've seen to units not having enough rifles, at least not unless they're surrounded, and no reference to units throwing themselves at the Germans without enough rifles, so I guess that the film Enemy at the Gates isn't an accurate representation of what was actually going on. Let's look at the tank production. At first glance, the lamentable tank state of the panzer divisions, especially those with Heeresgruppe Nord and Mitte, appears to be representative of an overall shortage of armoured vehicles within the German army. Certainly this is the conclusion presented within the post-war literature, even though most provide scant details, if any. The Soviets had 22,600 tanks at the beginning of the war in 1941 compared to the German 6,364. That's a ratio of 3.5 to 1 in favour of the Soviets. Most of these Soviet tanks are light tanks, which is probably why the Germans reduced the Soviet tanks to 9,325 by May of 1942. As you can see though, the number of German tanks actually increased by June of 1942 from 6,364 to 6,863, and the number of medium tanks in that number grew from 2,213 to 3,327. So German tank numbers were both increasing and improving in quality between 1941 and mid 1942. The ratio of tanks is 1.36 in the Soviets' favour, which is a lot less than the 3.5 to 1 they enjoyed in 1941. But wait, isn't this the time when the Germans are being defeated at Moscow? So why is that? The Soviets have less tanks than they did at the beginning of the war, yet the Germans are now suddenly losing. Same again by the 1st of December 1942, with 7,768 German tanks on the field. Please note that the increase in the lighter models is actually an increase in the number of Stugs, which are great machines, so that's not a problem. Compare this to the Soviet tanks from November of 1942, just before Operation Uranus, at 13,798. Most of these Soviet tanks are in fact light tanks, and the medium tanks are at parity with the Germans for the first time since the beginning of the war. But if you look at the ratio, the Soviets don't even outnumber the Germans 2 to 1 at this point, at 1.77 to 1 in the Soviets' favour. By the 1st of July 1943, the Germans have 11,447 tanks, the most they've ever had, versus the Soviet 21,000, a ratio of 1.84 to 1 in the Soviets' favour, and the quality of the German tanks is improving all the time, as are the Soviets obviously, but the German equipment is actually there. Where is this myth that the Germans were starved of equipment? It clearly doesn't exist. They had the equipment, they had the tanks, the statistics prove it. Up until 1943, the Germans grew their tank production year on year, and the Soviets never quite recovered the tank losses they had in 1941. They almost do this by July of 1943, but even so, the ratio compared to the German tanks at this point is nothing like it was in 1941. Now, some of you will point out, but the German panzer divisions were understocked, they didn't have enough tanks. Well, obviously some were in the middle of a battle, yes, but let's look at this other table from a different source. So obviously the numbers are slightly different, but the stock that the Germans had on the 1st of July 1942 was 6,558. 1,613 of that was on other fronts, 2,836 was on the Eastern Front, and 2,109 tanks were lost in the ether. No, seriously, they were either in storage or were simply unaccounted for, or they were in fact actually at the front. This leaves 2,109 tanks and assault guns unaccounted for. Evidently more armoured vehicles are either on the Eastern Front, or at least should have been, than the diminutive figures cited with the panzer divisions have led scholars to believe. Admittedly, because of severe shortages of spare parts, a number of these may actually have been in long-term repair. Consequently, they might have been located in maintenance facilities within Germany, or at major tank repair centres established within the occupied Eastern territories. However, they also may have been with formations in the field but went unreported by these units, since they were not expected to become operational for an extended period of time. The temptation and benefits of exasperating deficiencies and the German army's shambolic reporting methods at this time may also have played a role. The reference to the shambolic reporting practices of the German army should ring alarm bells if it hasn't done already. Why are we doubting Soviet numbers when they give them, but not German numbers? Historians have trusted the Germans more for political, military, or even cultural reasons, but the reality is there are large discrepancies in both the narrative and the statistics. German tank numbers speak volumes for this problem, and perhaps explains why nobody can be sure what the actual casualty ratio was for both sides. But here's what the statistics are suggesting. The German army tank numbers grew, even if they didn't reach the troops in the field. Given all these varied complexities and inconsistencies, historians could perhaps be forgiven for never having solidly ascertained what the circumstances of the Panzertruppen actually were by the summer of 1942. On the one hand, Germany's overall production of armoured vehicles surpassed known losses, and even with the addition of new formations, this should have translated into the Panzer divisions being largely restocked with the tanks they needed. On the other hand, the detailed figures we have for the actual strength of the Panzer divisions reveal significant shortages. A final conclusion awaits a more thorough study. So far we've looked at the numbers and realised that the Soviets didn't outnumber the Germans by 10 to 1 or another silly number. Instead, what we've seen is that the Soviets had fewer men at any one moment in time and 3.5 as many tanks compared to the Germans for most of 1941, twice as many men and tanks as the Germans in 1942 until Operation Uranus, and twice as many men and tanks in 1943 compared to the Germans. Yet, despite being outnumbered 2 to 1, the Germans were unable to repeat the successes they'd enjoyed in 1941. Okay, so if the German army wasn't superior to the Soviet Red Army, why then did the German army inflict massive losses on the Soviets in 1941? Well, at the start of Barbarossa, the Germans facing the Soviets had 3.9 million men in 151 divisions. The Red Army facing the Germans had 2.9 million men in 163 divisions. These numbers from Enduring the Whirlwind vary from the numbers that we had before, with both being inflated, but I think this just proves that nobody has the correct statistics. But the reason the Germans enjoyed success in 1941 is because they simply outnumbered the Red Army. At the beginning of the war, the Red Army had around 8 to 11,000 men in each division compared to the 14,500 they were meant to have had, and they distributed their forces evenly across the entire front, very socialist of them, rather than concentrating in tactical or operational or strategic positions. This was actually probably because they hadn't finished mobilising yet and just didn't have enough divisions in the west to actually man the entire front. Essentially, they were concentrated too far forward, with no operational depth, which is ideal conditions for the Germans to smash through the thin front lines and begin the encirclement operations that crushed them. So why then did the Germans do so well in 1941 and early 1942? The Germans had a war-winning strategy, Bewegungskrieg, often called Blitzkrieg, but according to Glantz and Robert Citino, this is the more historically accurate term, Bewegungskrieg. The Germans would concentrate their hard-hitting units against the soft targets of the enemy. At the Schwerpunkt, or focus point, they would outnumber the Soviets, easily breaking through their lines. Once the German panzers were in the operational depths, they could just drive forwards hundreds of miles, destroying all the rear service units in their path. Having encircled a large chunk of the Red Army, or having simply ran out of steam, they would dig in and wait until the pocket was destroyed or until supplies and reinforcements could reach them. The Red Army, on the other hand, was constantly attacking, usually everywhere along the front, failing to concentrate their forces in one area for one reason or another. In desperation, they were trying to slow the Germans down or trying to break through to the encircled force. A good example is, in fact, the Kotlebane operations at Stalingrad. On the tactical and operational level, they were on the attack against a defender. Often an attacking force has to have a superior force ratio to the defender in order to succeed, and an attacking force usually takes more losses than a defending opponent. The Red Army in 1941 and 1942 did not have the equipment, the manpower, nor the time, thanks to Bewegungskrieg, to concentrate the necessary forces needed at a specific point in the front to make a breakthrough. They had to keep hitting the Germans over and over again, desperately trying to slow them down. This alone explains the higher losses sustained by the Red Army. But when you consider that the Red Army was on the attack right up until 1945, it's actually astounding that their losses weren't significantly higher. So why did the Germans start losing? By the end of 1941, the Soviets were no longer outnumbered by the Germans for the first real time in the war. While they certainly didn't have enough manpower or equipment, they did have just enough to stop the Germans outside of Moscow. The Germans were beaten by the Red Army. In 1942, the Germans regained the initiative, striking through the Ukraine to Stalingrad and the Caucasus. German military operations had historically aimed not at seizing territory, however, but at the destruction of armies, and the number of prisoners had been far below expectations. It was now clear to everyone that the entire operational scheme for Blue, with its highly elaborate juxtaposition of staggering starts, concentric manoeuvres, and large-scale encirclements chopped up into small ones, had failed miserably. Indeed, in its current operational shape, 20th of June 1942, it could only be described as a mess. The problem was that once they'd broken through the Soviet front lines, Blau turned into a fiasco. This is the reason the number of Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans decreases so dramatically in 1942 compared to 1941. The Wehrmacht went from bad to worse, losing its way in the vastness of the Don Bend in a vain search for Soviet forces to destroy. It was not a pretty sight. A huge and still immensely powerful army flailing around on a fruitless hunting expedition. It turned east and southeast, then south and southwest, each new direction yielding nothing, and resulted in a decision to go even deeper in search of its prey. Bewegungskrieg had its limits, and this was shown in 1942 and 1943, let alone 1941. No longer able to encircle and destroy large swathes of enemy units, the panzers rolled into more determined resistance. By the middle of 1943, the Red Army had recovered from the horrendous losses sustained in the first year of the war. And, most importantly, they hadn't collapsed. When Barbarossa failed to finish the Soviet Union, that is when Germany lost the war. This was in 1941, even before Moscow. Blau, Stalingrad and Kursk couldn't replicate the successes of the first year of war, and the main reason was because the Red Army had recovered from its initial surprise and actually reinvented itself in the middle of war. The Soviets were then able to concentrate their forces at specific points in the front and hit individual German divisions with entire armies. For example, south of Stalingrad, 16th Motorized Division held a front of 250 kilometers, which is ridiculous anyway, against an entire Soviet army. But just because this one division was outnumbered by an enemy several times its size doesn't mean that the Germans were outnumbered by that amount across the entire front. Soviet deception operations were incredibly effective at tricking the Germans. They hid their plans and hid where they were about to strike. By early 1943, it took Manstein, the best general that Germany had, to stabilise the front. But even Manstein, at the height of German power in the east at Kursk in 1943, couldn't even break through the Soviet front lines. The Soviets had learnt not only how to defeat the Bewegungskrieg, but also the Schwerpunkt. And they did this by outnumbering the Germans by 2-1 at best. There may have been more Soviets from 1942 onwards than their German counterparts, but they didn't have hordes of men like the Germans claimed that they did. Let us put to bed the myth of German Wehrmacht superiority and see the Soviets not as inferiors, but as equals in the fighting. If we can do that, we can look upon the German success in 1941 in a whole new light. Not only did they achieve truly amazing results, they achieved this against an equal enemy. Unfortunately for them, that equal enemy was also able to recover from the initial blow and strike back with a vengeance. I will conclude the video by saying this. As stated in the last video, your perception of the Eastern Front really is wrong, unless you have a less German-centric view of the conflict than most people. If you would like a follow-up to this video, I highly recommend the video Why Germany Lost, The Three Alibis, where Jonathan House, a historian who worked with Glantz, lays out the reasons why the original German explanations for the loss in the war don't make any sense. Link in the description below and on the screen. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye for now.